I have, you've obviously announced the Opus more or less officially. I gather yesterday was sort of the announcement of its acceptance as a standard, right?
Yeah, I guess it was 2 days ago, but yeah, so it's a very recent thing, and obviously we're really happy that the ETF has standardized it. So we've been working on that for a few years. Started in 2009, and now it's all finalized. So very happy about that.
Right. Yeah. No, I guess I've followed it since the introduction of CELT.
Yeah.
I'm just going to shut this phone off. I guess first question is, what do you see as the key features for end users?
Yeah, I think for end users, there are three important elements to it. One is that it is a codec that will give really good quality, and that doesn't always just mean that it sounds better, but it means it sounds better given the available resources on the web. So it really tries to give the best user experience given what is available. And for Skype users, that will mean that the quality in the future will be even better than what it is now. So we'll have stereo and full band. Essentially, that means that it's CD quality. The other important.
When you say full band, you mean up to like 22 kilohertz audio support?
Yeah, so a sampling rate of 48 kilohertz. So indeed, it will be able to represent the entire range that humans can hear.
And of course, at the high end, that benefit comes with music.
Yeah, so indeed, Opus in that sense is different from CELT in that it has modes that are especially optimized for music. So it sounds really good for music, also already at fairly low bit rates. And I think that it outperforms any of the other existing standards that are out there.
I think it was interesting to find that recently I found there were some people who are actually using just Skype with CELT to do music training.
Yeah, so that works, but CELT is indeed not as optimized for music as Opus is. So I guess, as you know, Opus is a fusion of two codecs. One of them is CELT, which we've developed at Skype, and the other codec is CELT, which was built mostly by ziv.org. And so I think Opus is actually more than just the sum of the two codecs. It's a codec that can do anything that has to do with using audio over the internet, and that's really useful.
So talking about using audio over the internet, you've maintained all the ability to adapt to internet conditions and so on. In other words, like right now with Skype for Windows, for instance, I notice sometimes I get a message saying it's trying to adapt to the network, that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So when you're making a call over the internet, Skype is always attempting to determine how many resources are available, what's the available bandwidth over the internet, and that depends on a lot of factors. And especially when you're on like wireless, like Wi-Fi, or on a 3G link, the available internet resources vary over time. It depends on what other people are doing, and so you need to be adjusting to that all the time on the fly. And so having a codec that is able to do that actually is really helpful, and I think Opus is able to do that better than any other codec.
Looking at the video yesterday, and what occurred to me, and I've got, I don't know if Koen's told you, I've got some background. I used to sell spectrum analysis equipment. I recently, 10 years ago now, was involved in purchasing an electronic organ that's better than anything else you can find. It's truly reproducing all the overtones and the high harmonics and so on.
Yeah.
What are the demands on, say, the CPU of the device? Because there seems to be a lot of activity going on.
Well, so in that sense, Opus is also good in that it can adapt to the available CPU resources. So when you're implementing or when you're using codec as a developer in the API, there is a setting that determines the complexity, and I think it scales maybe a factor 3 or so. So the lowest complexity setting is maybe 3 times or maybe 4 times as efficient as the highest complexity setting. Obviously, when you use a lower complexity setting, either the quality is a little bit lower, or you have to run at a higher bitrate to achieve the same quality. But we think it's actually really useful. So when you're, let's say, when you're running on a laptop, most likely you'll have enough resources to just run the codec at the highest complexity setting, even when you're maybe also encoding a video signal. But when you're running on mobile, depending on how fast your mobile CPU is and depending on whether you're using video, it may be better to reduce the complexity and thereby kind of optimize the total user experience, especially when you're including video at the same time.
So fundamentally, you can adopt the deployment of the codec to the level of support the CPU can give.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
It's all nice to have all this broadband stuff, but one of the big issues with CELT and other very broadband codecs has been its deployment on devices. I mean, right now, I can only do, say, CELT calls when I call somebody else on Skype.
Yeah. And that's, go ahead.
My question is, how do you see the deployment coming about so that this gets into other endpoint devices, that sort of thing? And obviously, the other thing is that you got companies like XConnect that are trying to set up ways to interconnect HD voice or higher bandwidth voice calls. I mean, how do you see that all evolving?
Yeah, so I think for that area, it's especially useful that Opus is now a standard. So because it's a standard, I'm fairly sure it will be widely adopted. We already know, for instance, that it sits in the Firefox web browser, and I expect it to go into other web browsers as well. So that means, for instance, that you can in the future, you can quite likely at some point make Skype calls, let's say, from a Skype endpoint to a web browser, or you can make calls between 2 web browsers and so on. And I think it will also mean it gets adopted into hardware more widely. Let's say maybe manufacturers will optimize Opus for hardware like mobile hardware or TV hardware and other embedded devices. And I think as a third example of that, we're hoping that gateway manufacturers will also adopt Opus and implement it in their gateways, and that's good for, let's say, when you're making a Skype out call, then you would initiate the call from Skype using Opus, and it would go over Opus to the gateway, and then from the gateway it will go onto the PSTN network, and I think that will give a better user experience than what we're using now.
So, yeah, that was one of my questions in the sense of getting through, say, a SIP gateway and so on. You see ways that can happen then?
Eventually, yeah. So there is, it isn't up to us. It's indeed a matter of having the gateway manufacturers implement Opus, and I'm optimistic that it will happen.
Okay. So Opus is now officially standardized. When do you see it showing up in Skype clients?